Mr. President, for some time now, Americans have suspected that this administration has lost touch with the American people. John Meekin, the former editor of Newsweek and a fan of the president, explained this detachment by saying that the president does not, quote, particularly like people, unquote. Now, that might be an overstatement, but Meekin is on to something. This administration seems to take its cues from the far left, whether they represent the aspiration and hopes of ordinary Americans or not. Nowhere is this disconnection from the American people on better display than with the ham-fisted decision by Secretary Kathleen Sebelius and the Department of Health and Human Services to require that religious persons and institutions violate their most cherished beliefs or face the consequences. Late last year, HHS ordered all employers, including religious institutions, to cover in their employer insurance plans such things as sterilization, contraception, and abortion-inducing drugs and devices. With very limited exceptions, various hospitals, universities, and charitable institutions would face the choice of dropping coverage for their employees or violating their consciences. The nation's Catholic bishops and many other religious institutions pleaded with this administration to grant broader waivers to avoid jeopardizing these institutions' constitutional rights to freely exercise religion. But the administration, rather than side with millions of religious Americans who just want to be left alone to practice their own faith, decided to throw in with the most radical of pro-abortion advocates. They decided to subordinate our central constitutional commitment to religious liberty to a radical agenda that is overtly hostile to all of these people of faith. The response has been overwhelming. At church this weekend, millions of American Catholics were read a letter from their bishops. The message was simple and it was powerful. This action is unjust and one with which they will not comply. They are right, and they shouldn't. The First Amendment doubly protects religious liberty, it prohibits a government establishment of religion, and explicitly protects the free exercise of religion, the first individual right listed in the Bill of Rights. That's how important religious liberty is to America. And in our system of government, such fundamental rights and principles are supposed to trump statutes, regulations, and political agendas. The Constitution and the liberties it protects are supreme, not the fleeting and politically driven motivations of any particular administration. Yet the Obama administration, as it always does, has turned these priorities upside down. In this administration, politics trumps absolutely everything else, even the Constitution and religious liberty. Instead of conforming their political agendas to the Constitution, they distort the Constitution and even liberty itself to conform to their political agenda. The politicians driving this mandate underestimated the American people who have, in succession, rejected the sorry efforts by the administration to defend its actions. The administration first hid behind the opinion of a purportedly objective medical group that birth control should be included in health insurance plans. But the American people knew who was ultimately responsible for this rule. Not some board of so-called experts, but the president and his officers. They tried to minimize this mandate's impact by arguing that many states already have similar requirements. But this was incredibly misleading, since nearly all of those states have much broader religious protections. In fact, only 3 states have religious exemptions as narrow and limited as this new federal mandate. They tried to assuage the concerns of religious citizens by saying that the rule does not cover churches and houses of worship. But Americans will not accept only the remnant of our constitutional rights that the president chooses to recognize. Were we supposed to thank the Obama administration for letting us retain a few scraps of religious liberty? There are many religious institutions and organizations that do not fit into the Obama administration's artificial, narrow categories that just as fully exercise their faith and religious mission. Religious liberty belongs to the Catholic hospital, or the University of Notre Dame, no less than it belongs to the Catholic Church. And then when this simmering controversy broke wide open a few weeks ago, Secretary Sebelius thought she could make it all go away by agreeing not to impose this mandate for another year. Like her boss, the president, she just plain doesn't get it. Religious liberty is not a bargaining chip or a deal sweetener like premium floor mats or an upgraded appliance. Did she think that Americans would not mind losing this cherished liberty if they were allowed to spend just a little extra time with it? The Obama administration's attitude toward religious liberty has become, enjoy it while it lasts. And to the administration's surprise, the American people have been less than enthusiastic about this cavalier attitude toward constitutional rights. The President of the United States takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution, to stand up for the fundamental liberty of all Americans. He and the officials responsible for this mandate have fallen far short of this oath. Mr. President, the fight for religious liberty began before America was born, and it must be fought continually. We can all see that now. It is a part of our constitutional heritage. Our founding fathers pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to defend the principle that all people are created equal and endowed by God with certain unalienable rights. The right for persons and institutions to be free to practice their faith without undue interference by the government is among our most cherished rights and liberty. There was a day when liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, everyone joined together to defend liberty. I should know. I was the principal Republican sponsor and wrote the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which brought together unprecedented grassroots and congressional coalitions to defend this first freedom. They knew that rights such as religious liberty rise and fall together, that religious liberty cannot be packaged, sliced and diced and doled out in little pieces to please certain interest groups. We need that same unity today because religious liberty is just as important and sadly just as threatened as it was in the past. In addition to violating the First Amendment right to freely exercise our religion, this mandate also appears to violate that landmark law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It burdens the free exercise of religion and is clearly not, as the law requires, a narrow means of achieving a compelling purpose. Mr. President, just last month, the Supreme Court unanimously held that the right of religious organizations to decide who may further their religious mission trumps non-discrimination statutes. The Obama administration argued that religious organizations are really nothing special, that they should have no more freedom from federal control than, say, a labor union or a social club. In other words, religious liberty is simply no big deal to the Obama administration. Writing for the entire Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts called this a remarkable view of religious liberty, one that is, quote, hard to square with the text of the First Amendment itself, which gives special solicitude to the rights of religious organizations, unquote. Soon the Supreme Court will have the opportunity to rule on the constitutionality of Obamacare. What the Preventive Services mandate confirms beyond all doubt is that the constitutional defects in Obamacare only begin with the insurance mandate that will be before the Supreme Court. There are some other issues there as well, and I hope the court examines every one of them and overturns this law that is so improperly formed. The very DNA of Obamacare is unconstitutional. At its core, the law and its expansion of government are a threat to personal liberty. The decision to implement this law in a way that forces religious institutions to violate their deepest principles is a vivid demonstration of what happens to personal liberty when the power of the state expands. As the state controls more and more of our lives to further a political agenda, our freedom is put in greater and greater jeopardy. Mr. President, after 3 years of this administration, the American people seem to be saying enough is enough. Those responsible for this decision to force religious institutions to subsidize health coverage for abortifacient drugs need to be brought to account. The President needs to answer for this. Secretary Sebelius needs to answer for this. The Attorney General needs to answer for this. How could he let this happen? But let me just say, but getting answers is not enough. Congress needs to assert its authority as the representative of the American people to stand up for the First Amendment and restore religious liberty by overturning this health care law. For those who are on the front lines fighting this mandate, I applaud your courage, and please understand that you are not alone, and you are Democrats, Independents, Republicans, and others. The Obama administration may not care about religious liberty, but the Constitution does. And I, along with many of my colleagues, will fight alongside you until we prevail over this unjust law. This new HHS mandate cannot be allowed to stand. And I am confident that if the will of the American people prevails, it will not stand. I belong to a faith that has been persecuted and mischaracterized for many, many decades. We're the only church in the history of America that had a governor issue an extermination order against its members. That's how bad it got. In this greatest of all countries, where religious liberty is one of our most, is probably our most, without question, our most valued right. We understand what it's like to be persecuted. Now, I don't care whether you're liberal, conservative, independent, or what. And I don't care what religious beliefs folks out there all have. I do care about their beliefs. There is no excuse for this type of heavy-handed, ham-handed over-governmentalization of our religious freedom. And we simply cannot allow this to stand. Now, Mr. President, I think you ought to talk to your people down there in the White House and say, enough is enough. You guys have got me in enough trouble down here. Mr. President, do you have the guts to stand up for religious liberty? If you don't, you should not be President of this United States under this beautiful, beloved Constitution. If you do, I'll be the first to compliment you for it. The fact of the matter is, this is one of the worst things I've seen in many, many years. And it goes beyond the issues that some are raising. It comes right down to the Constitution itself, and in many respects, I believe the most important provision in the Constitution, something that our early leaders risked their lives to obtain because they were persecuted because of their religious beliefs. And it's unseemly to have this administration continue that type of persecution. Mr. President, I call on you to change this, to acknowledge that this is a mistake, and to understand that we're united, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and others are united in the protection of this great liberty. And it's time to tell the folks who are so dedicated to their personal political positions that enough is enough. Mr. President, I